There is a lot of discussion these days within non-duality about no self, that particular shift, and what does it actually mean. And there are various different views about it, and debates, arguments, wide range of experiential accounts. So it's a term that has become quite common, which then can cause misunderstandings at times when we hear someone using that expression, like what do they actually mean? So the way that I understand it, there is the initial no-self insight. And then there is a maturation of that insight into something that could be then called true no-self. And within spirituality, that initial no-self insight is quite rare. Like most of spirituality focuses on this type of consciousness is everything view, talking about awareness, realization of pure awareness. And no self, it's not that. It's something of a completely different order. And besides this, everything is consciousness view, which can be a little bit mental. And there is a lot of emphasis in spirituality, this type of heart-based approach, which emphasizes compassion or emphasizes universal love, emphasizes that everything is connected, emphasizes the fundamental unity or oneness of all being. And in these types of views, there is often an emphasis, strong emphasis on that fundamental oneness being divine, that being God. So that that comes with a very specific type of implications, actually. So, like the maturity of spirituality is about one of these two. This everything is consciousness view, which also has different phases and different insights and deepenings, and then this heart-based approach of spirituality on compassion, loving kindness, divine union, you name it. And within that mainstream, you could say awakening-oriented spirituality, because this is a form of awakening, both of those, you could say, areas or facets of exploration. When you talk about no self, they don't really even, it's not even included in the view often in those types of forms of spirituality or those type of traditions. Like it's this path to no self is completely invisible for them and even threatening for them, because it's something very, very different than what I was just describing here. Because actually a lot of those positive byproducts that come with these type of awakenings, like unity or everything is consciousness, when we start to shift towards no self, it feels like all of that falls away. There's falling away of bliss, there's falling away of emotion largely. In this process of the identity structure dissolving. So that's not very marketable. And that's why it's not really wanted usually by people who pursue the mainstream spirituality. They're not interested in this. And if this is being mentioned, like I said, either it sounds something threatening, or they don't even hear what is being said, that this expression no self is interpreted to mean, oh, it's just another word for awareness, but without personal self. No, no self is something of a very specific nature. So if this initial no self insight, this dissolution or falling away of the self structure, if that is rare, then it is even more rare for that insight to mature or develop, to transition into what could be called true no self, but there's just no names for it really. I like to call it basic sanity. I like to call it suchness. I like to call it sensing radiance. And this transition, that's almost not discussed at all, like almost nowhere. There are some very, very few maps and views out there that do mention it, if you're lucky to find them. But it's kind of like an invisible passage. And many people have traversed this path without having no idea what's happening to them, even if they had some sort of guidance on the way, because it is a very solitary journey. And that's one of the hallmarks of no self-realization that comes with the initial insight, or even the preparatory phases that lead to the initial insight, is a sense of profound existential aloneness, like deep, deep sense of solitary nature. And that's, again, not marketable for the mainstream seekers who want connectivity, who want love, who want union, who want togetherness, who want community, who want spiritual family, and all of those things. And I think that transition, that secret passage, is something that is probably only shared in oral discussions if it has been part of the tradition, so it's not part of the formal teachings. And in many ways, it's not a teaching at all. Like if you happen to have someone holding space for you when you are in that transition, it's not about teaching. That person is merely just holding a clear mirror, for you at times when you need it, so that your process can kind of collapse in this clarity, in this mutual reflection. And this transition, it involves a complete rewiring and recalibration of the nervous system, and in many ways of our whole physiology. So it's a very physical, perhaps even biological process that happens there. Of course, if we had already awakening insight, like deep insight, the physicality is not really physical. Like we experience and we know that everything is empty, or everything is just energy, consciousness, pure potentiality, just vibrating field of aliveness, like self-modulating, boundlessness, transparency. However, at this stage, this knowing is actually only at the level of, we could say, awareness. So it's a very genuine insight into the nature of reality that we get with the initial no-self shift. But where this transformation eventually takes you is something that is not describable in words. Like, if you would try to talk about it in words, it would just sound like what I already said, like this boundless, sentient field of kaleidoscopic patterning. But when it's heard and understood and realized at the level of awareness, that's one thing. When that realization is thoroughly metabolized, assimilated, digested, it's a kind of gut level release that takes place there, then it turns into something that we can't really have any kind of intuition about it. Even if we, in certain sense, get foretastes about it, like glimpses during this process, but they are so utterly not translatable, so that they are kind of then processed by this symbolic mind and understood as an insight at the level of awareness, whereas the actual experiential, visceral reality of it is something of a completely different order. And what's really astonishing about it is its ordinariness, this basic sanity. So it's kind of like absolute ordinary. And again, we hear these terms many, many times during the awakening process. And these insights can also be realized at the level of awareness. Oh, that it's just this ordinary human life that's awakening. That's the only thing there is. So this information comes with a little bit of a trigger warning, because this transition is not easy. And like I said, it's not really talked about. So you don't really understand what's happening for you if you find yourself in it. And it has some kind of, could say, serious dangers. And I'm saying this in a very light sense, because this is all just a game. But one of the pitfalls, if you want to call them, is a kind of social isolation that often takes place. And there needs to be a certain amount of isolation, especially towards the end phases of it. For it to complete itself, you really need to go through this on your own in many ways. It doesn't mean that you need to completely isolate yourself, because we're not living in monasteries, and it's not like that. But usually life naturally orchestrates in that way, that you will have that type of time and space for yourself, or there will otherwise very likely be friction, in your relationships, if you have very close relationship around you when you go through this type of transition. And this isolation can be painful, because what is being kind of overridden here in our system is the survival instinct and the identity that lives in the survival instinct and the self-protection mechanism. And for that part of our biology, this isolation, it registers as a real physical threat, for our well-being, for our survival. So there's also this unfiltered nature of experience that becomes available after the no self insight. Everything is kind of very raw, very immediate, very immersive. There are no buffers. So when this fear of isolation or this fear of annihilation arises, there is an intensity to it. And this is, again, something that is not at all discussed in the mainstream spirituality, which is all about the positive effects of awakening. So they don't understand at all this type of shift and what it means. It includes everything, like the whole spectrum of duality, good and bad, light and dark. And there's no way to explain that, but it can be experienced firsthand. So yeah, you will face fear for sure. And you will also face other emotions that are not generally considered associated to awakening. You will face this core wound of inadequacy, worthlessness, shame, fear of humiliation, insecurity. Like all of that stuff is so unfiltered now. You can't anymore escape it when the identity structure is not there. And that can then also be super confusing. Like what is happening? Like where did the awakening disappear? Where did all the bliss and all the joy, all the well-being disappear that usually follows the initial awakening inside, the kind of honeymoon of awakening? So it can be simply physically extremely strange that all of that seems to disappear. And you're like, is something going wrong here? Like, has something gone wrong? Is there something wrong with me? And then that sense of wrongness usually then manifests as grasping. You start to grasp, you start to hold, you start to fight against this process. It's just natural. Like it happens to a certain extent to everyone because you're sinking there. You're sinking into the absolute. And the system is resisting it. It's going to resist it. It's unavoidable. But the more you're able to relax, the more you will be embrace this process, this transition, this integration, this assimilation. You will just simply have to embrace that intensity, which will be there for quite a while. Or it can come in waves. And with the no self insight, you see that it is just energy. It's not good or bad, and fundamentally, pain is not different from pleasure. But when our kind of physical hardware is being updated like that, like rewired, like our gut, our nervous system, our brain, like everything. So you will likely have headaches. Many people have that in connection with the no self shift, like inside headaches, or just pain in various parts of the body, like some contracted places, and where we are simply asked to stay there in that friction, to feel that contact. So it's just the friction when this type of calcified, rigidified conditioning is coming in contact with this pure transparency of no self. So experientially, that feels like a kind of like irritation, can also feel like nausea. But if we are able to simply stay in pure sensation, we can see that we are totally fine. It can feel overwhelming, but we are totally fine. Our system has a capacity to go through this. And you can also see that the intensity is empty. It's totally non-substantial. And this, of course, creates tremendous freedom during this passage. But yeah, you will know hopelessness, and you will have to go even beyond hopelessness. And you will face the deep shadow. Like it needs to happen, this enigmatic integration of the shadow material in our being, for this insight of no self to really integrate. And there is a deep well-being on the other side of this process, which is actually a lot more fundamental than the initial well-being that comes with the awakening insight and the honeymoon. Because if that was a period of time and then it disappeared, it was still that type of bliss that comes and goes. So this type of bliss that's on the other side of it this transition, and which we also have glimpses, I think, during the transition, is the kind of bliss that doesn't come and go, which is not an emotion at all. It's not a state at all. It's kind of like intense aliveness or sensitivity. But it's also totally indifferent. And that indifference can evoke fear or terror in the conditioned mind, or in the remnants of conditioning that is being devoured in this process. But yeah, it's this very peculiar fusion of pure bliss and lack of interest, which makes the experience not really feel that human anymore, which is again another weird paradox, because in a way you are more human than ever in this process. Like, this is really very, very human, this process. It doesn't look at all like awakening is usually represented to look like. This process will feel and perhaps look messy. It will look very human, like you will be grinded down, down, down on the earth. You know, and for that sense of identity that is still echoing in the system, that may feel like humiliation, but it's really a deep grounding, you know, that we are kind of forced to give up that apparent throne of awakening, you know, awakened identity, which often comes with the initial awakening. We feel very, you know, uplifted, elevated by it. Even we know that there's no self about it, but it feels very, you know, expansive and free like that. And this process will just pull you into the body, pull you into the somatics. You know, it will pull you all the way down to the ground, the absolute ground. And it doesn't really appear like that when it's happening. The absolute ground feels like nothing. Initially, it feels like nothing, but it's actually a very powerful place to be. Like, it's so full of beingness, of isness. And this type of fullness is, again, totally different than the kind of emptiness fullness we may realize at the level of awareness. Like, this type of empty fullness is kind of like a force of nature. You know, it brings to me now when I talk about it, this type of images like volcano. It's this unmanifest potentiality, but experienced directly. And it's starting to function as us while we go through this transition. Because where this whole thing kind of leads is the discovery of total exertion or total dynamic functioning. So the agency will be completely annihilated in this process, the agency and the control. And those are kind of the hallmarks of egoic function. So for the ego, it's absolutely terrifying, this loss of agency and loss of control during this process. But yeah, when we go all the way through with this loss of agency, loss of control, we end up in you would say, total agency. Like there's zero identity about it. There's kind of no one home. It's just this direct reality functioning. So in this process, you might feel not very functional. That's another pitfall that is maybe good to mention, that this transition often makes people not that functional in the consensus world. But if you go all the way through with it, you become this pure function. It's just this isness functioning without any otherness, without any self. And we would say that it's pure connectivity. It's pure connectivity, but it's not that kind of connection that we are used at the level of identity. So for that kind of connection, this is a kind of permanent end, and you feel it when this journey begins. It's like you exit the human world for good. And I don't want it to sound threatening or anything like that, but yeah, that's just one of the hallmarks. And of course, the human experience is always here. It's not like you become something other. But when this social cultural conditioning that creates this type of conditioned behavioral and thinking patterns, when that is being assimilated, like burned, digested, what it allows is a kind of human experience that is sometimes referred to as the natural state. So the humanness is there, but a specific kind of, human experience is not, which is the capacity to relate to that consensus stream, that social dream and social control. And sometimes it's called matrix, but the matrix is a lot more all-encompassing than we could ever imagine. So it's not only that the so-called normal world is matrix, the spiritual world is, or the spiritual views and traditions, they're equally part of this matrix. So if you think you escape from the normal world matrix or control, and then you find a spiritual community, you will likely discover that it's exactly the same stuff occurring there. That's why this type of awakening that comes with personal well-being is primarily advertised within that type of spirituality and within that type of spiritual communities. And what you will notice is that they always emphasize agency and control, because it's based on the identity, the ego, just kind of achieving a mode of being that appears more, spiritual than the normal mode of being. These type of practices that are very much based on progression, that are based on doership, that if you do this, then you will achieve something, that emphasize very much that it's important to stay in control. It's emphasized that it's very important to do it in a specific way, and you are told very precisely this type of like religious practices. And spirituality often claims that it's something other than religion, but it's oftentimes not, when we are given this type of practices that are based on agency and are based on control, or the kind of worldview that assumes that there is individual agency and individual control. And of course, there are also some traditions and views. Sometimes they're called the direct way, or the pathless path, or no path, that offer a view and offer an approach which is based on the open acknowledgement that there is no control and there is no agency. So from the beginning, when we are doing practice, we are not attempting to control it. We are not attempting to create any kind of states. We are not attempting to go somewhere, the progress. It's more about pointing out how we might still be manipulating our experience, how we might still be unconsciously attempting to make something happen. So that's the direct way, which is very powerful when it is intuitively cracked and taken upon. Like you can go all the way through with that. There's natural non-meditation, as it is sometimes called. So traditions that offer that kind of approach are Dzogchen, Mahamudra, for example. And our age is very interesting because now these type of teachings about deep realization start to be available online, like in YouTube. You can just randomly find a video that talks about it. This type of stuff that usually was not at all talked about, even within the communities and practice cultures in a wider scale, that it was probably like an oral teaching or something. This is just my guess. I don't know. So this is not meant to scare anyone. I know that for the consensus mind, this kind of process appears absolutely like horrifying and Western psychiatry associates it with, or when it's being discussed, the way that they hear it through their psychological frameworks, they associate it with dissociation or depersonalization or derealization, which is kind of ironic because this is like that actually the total opposite of that type of spectrum, which is like dissociation, derealization, depersonalization. This is like full presence, like full unmediated contact. So in that sense, it's intimacy, but it's not intimacy in any human sense. So when you hear this kind of message about no self, about deep realization, it's not that important to get stuck in words. It's not that important to understand it intellectually, like what does that actually mean? Like you don't need to figure it out. It's more about if you recognize a kind of unexclipable resonance, familiarity about that communication. It's not about the words. Someone else could be speaking about this same stuff in a very different way. So it's more like you recognize a frequency there. But I do think this has happened within all traditions, even it's not usually acknowledged within most of the traditions. Like, for example, within Christianity, it's not at all part of their view, part of their map. And yet we have this example of Bernadette Roberts, who wrote these very fascinating books about no self and transition to no self. And she wasn't seeking it at all. It was just happening for her. And yeah, she remained a nun, and she remained part of that social frame, or spiritual frame, but she was speaking from this place and communicating from this place. And if you have this orientation towards truth, if this happens to you, then it's a lot more easier to embrace this unfolding, to embrace this unbinding, to embrace this assimilation. Because in a way, this is everything you've been ever wanting and longing for. And even though it doesn't feel like anything you could have projected or imagined or anything you could have ever foreseen, somehow there's also amazing beauty in it all. Like non-dual beauty, like radical beauty, aliveness, power, beyond the conventional mind, beyond comprehension, beyond description. You could say it's the ultimate aesthetic experience.